I want to start by saying that when you're 18 and living away from home for the first time, your baseline for what's normal gets recalibrated fast. Things that would have alarmed you at home start to seem like just part of the adjustment. Weird hours, strange habits, people who operate differently than anyone you've known before. You tell yourself it's just college. You tell yourself everyone is figuring it out. You give more passes than you probably should because you don't want to be the first person who can't handle it. I gave way too many passes for too long, and it took something happening that couldn't be explained away before I finally admitted what I'd known for months. My roommate's name was Daniel. We were matched randomly through the university housing system, the way most freshmen are. A questionnaire about sleep schedules and study habits and noise preferences that gives the illusion of compatibility without really guaranteeing anything. On paper, I guess we were similar. Both moderate sleepers, both relatively neat, both listed as quiet studiers. But in practice, we were nothing alike. But that really wasn't the problem. Plenty of mismatched roommates survive each other. The problem was something else. Daniel kept things I didn't know about. That sounds vague, so let me be specific. About 3 weeks into the semester, I opened the wrong drawer in the small dresser between our two beds. Mine was the top drawer. His was the bottom two. And I opened the middle drawer by accident, reaching for something of mine. I closed it immediately because it wasn't mine, but not before I saw what was in it. Photographs. Printed photographs, not phone photos. Actual prints. The kind you get developed, a stack of them. The top one, which I saw clearly before I closed the drawer, was a photo of a girl I recognized from our floor. Taken from a distance, outside, her back partially to the camera. She wasn't posing, and she didn't know the photo was being taken. I closed the drawer immediately and stood there for a second, and then talked myself down. Photography was a hobby, plenty of people did it. Candid shots were a style. I didn't know what the rest of the photos were. I'd seen one for 2 seconds, and I was constructing a story around it. I had to let it go. I noticed things after that, though, the way you do once your attention has been pointed in a direction. Daniel left the room at odd hours without explaining where he was going, which was normal enough, except that sometimes I'd see him coming back across the quad from my window, and he'd be coming from the direction of the women's dorm 2 buildings over, at 2 or 3 in the morning, on nights when there were no social events or parties to really explain it. He asked questions that felt slightly off, to be honest. Not alarming questions, just questions where the specific information he was after didn't really match the casual framing around it. He'd make conversation about people on our floor, then work towards asking specific things about their schedules. When did so-and-so usually get out from class? Did I know if the girl in room 14 had a boyfriend? Had I noticed whether anyone on the floor kept their door unlocked during the day? I answered very vaguely, started doing it automatically without deciding to. About 2 months in, the girl in room 14, her name was Megan. I knew her a little. We talked a few times in the common area, mentioned to me in passing that she kept finding things slightly moved in her room. Nothing taken, nothing broken. Her desk chair at a different angle than she'd left it. A jacket that had been hanging on the back of the door relocated to the hook on the wall. Small displacements, the kind you doubt yourself about, truly. She mentioned it to the RA, who checked her room, had been locked and found no signs of forced entry, and concluded she was probably just misremembering where she'd put things. Freshman stress, the adjustment period, really the standard response from the RA. I didn't say anything to her about Daniel. Not then. I didn't have anything concrete enough to say. What changed, though, was a Sunday night in November. I came back to the room late after a study session in the library. Daniel was supposed to be there. His jacket was on the chair. His laptop was open on his desk. But he wasn't in the room. I assumed he'd stepped out briefly, bathroom or vending machine, and sat down at my own desk. His laptop screen was active, facing away from me, but the glow of it was visible. I really wasn't trying to look at it. I was at my own desk, facing my own work. But he'd positioned his monitor at an angle that meant when I shifted slightly to reach for something, I could see the screen. It was a live feed, a camera feed, a small window in the corner of the screen with a timestamp running, showing a room I recognized. The specific poster on the wall, the specific arrangement of the desk. It was Megan's room. There was a camera in Megan's room. I sat very still for a moment, and my heart started to beat. I got up, walked to the RA's room, and knocked on his door, and told him exactly what I'd seen. What followed was fast and serious in a way that told me the RA, to his credit, understood immediately what he was dealing with. Campus security was called. Daniel was intercepted before he came back to the room. The camera was found. A small device, the kind you buy online that connects to a phone or laptop, wedged behind a shelf in Megan's room in a position that covered most of the space. He was removed from the university housing that night. I don't know the full legal outcome. Student privacy rules meant most of it happened outside my view. I do know he was suspended. I know Megan had to spend 2 weeks processing something nobody should have to process. I got a single room for the rest of the year, an accommodation the housing offered without having to ask, which I took as an indication that they understood what the situation had been. I've thought about that drawer a lot since then, the one I opened by accident in September. The photograph on top, the girl whose back was to the camera, who didn't know she was being watched. I closed that drawer and talked myself down and let 2 months go by. I think about Megan and what those 2 months meant, and I think about the passes I gave. The bar I kept lowering for what counted as something worth saying out loud. I've never lowered that bar since, not once, and I regret that day, every day. Story 2. Professor Harlan. I was a junior when this happened, not a freshman overwhelmed by a new environment, not someone who could be written off as naive or inexperienced. I was 20 years old. I'd been on that campus for 2.5 years. I knew how things worked, and I knew how to read people. I say that not defensively, but because I think it really does matter. Because it could have happened to me in the way that it did, it could have happened to anyone. And I want to be clear before I tell you what the real story is. Professor Harlan taught a seminar I'd chosen specifically because of his reputation. Small class, upper level course, the kind that required an application to get into. I'd wanted it for 2 semesters before finally getting a spot in the class. 12 students, a seminar table instead of a lecture hall, the kind of academic environment I'd been working towards since I started at that school. He was in his 50s, well regarded in his field, the sort of professor who had the particular confidence of someone accustomed to being the most knowledgeable person in any room he entered. He was also, something that I noticed early, someone who'd paid different amounts of attention to different students in ways that weren't entirely about academic merit. He paid a lot of attention to me. At first, it read as mentorship. He remembered details from my contributions to class, Discussions referenced my previous comments when new topics came up, suggested additional reading in a way that felt tailored rather than generic. My academic advisor told me having a professor of his standing take a genuine interest was a significant opportunity. My parents said the same when I mentioned it. I tried to convince myself of the same thing for longer than I should have. The attention shifted gradually. Emails that started as course-related became longer, more personal in tone, asking about my life outside class, my plans after graduation, whether I was happy at school. Office hours that were professionally appropriate and structured but had a quality of extended time that I always left feeling slightly unsettled without being able to articulate why. Then he started appearing places. The coffee shop I went most mornings, 2 blocks from campus. I saw him there twice in 1 week, which I noted and dismissed as coincidence. It was close to campus, plenty of people from the university went there, and it was a great coffee shop. The third time, he arrived after me, scanned the room, and came directly to my table and sat down without asking, which crossed a line I felt clearly, but still managed to explain why. He was friendly. He was a mentor. These things happen. I needed to let it go. He mentioned once, casually, that he'd noticed I usually took the long route back to school, back to our residential buildings after seminar, along the path by the pond. I hadn't told him which way I walked home. I hadn't ever mentioned the pond path to anyone in the context of that class. The way he said it was light, conversational, not threatening. But I went home that afternoon and sat with it and understood, in that way you understand things you've been resisting, that he had seen me on the path, that he knew it was my route that I took regularly, that the knowing of it hadn't come from anything I'd ever told him. I started varying my route after that, different path each time, different timing. I told myself I was being cautious without being dramatic about it. 2 weeks later, a Tuesday evening in October, I was on a route I'd never taken before. Deliberately new, a street on the far side of campus I rarely had reason to ever use. Part of my attempt to be unpredictable, I guess. I was almost to my building when I heard footsteps behind me. Even paced, consistent, the kind that maintain distance rather than close it, the kind that aren't trying to catch up so much as just really keep my peace. I turned around. Professor Harlan was half a block behind me, hands in his coat pockets, moving at a walking pace, eyes finding mine the moment I turned. He raised a hand, a small wave, a greeting, and said my name, and said something about what a coincidence, heading back from the library. The library was in the opposite direction from where he was coming. I said goodnight and turned back and walked to my building at a pace that wasn't quite running. Got inside, went directly to my room, and locked the door. I sat on my bed for a long time, looking up at the plain, blank wall of my dorm. I thought about everything I'd been explaining away, every coffee shop appearance, every piece of information he had that I hadn't ever given him. The pond comment, the emails, the particular quality of attention I'd been reframing as professional because the alternative was something I hadn't wanted to deal with. I was done not dealing with it. I went to the university's Title IX office the next morning. Brought printed copies of the emails, wrote out a detailed timeline of every incident I could remember with dates where I had them. The coordinator I met with was thorough and took everything seriously, which was not an experience I'd been certain to expect and genuinely was grateful for it. The process that followed took most of the semester. I was moved to a different section of the course taught by another professor, which I was told was to protect my ability to continue the class without retaliation concerns. Professor Harlan was placed under investigation. I don't know the full outcome, which I'm assuming the outcome was probably nothing. What I know is that he did go on leave for a little bit, and by the time I graduated, his name was still on the faculty directory. What I do know is that a classmate reached out to me after word got around that I'd filed a report, carefully, privately, not sure how I'd receive it. She told me she had a similar experience with him the previous year and hadn't said anything because she hadn't thought someone would believe her. But I know that the Tuesday night on the path wasn't my usual path. Was not a coincidence. It was a route I'd never taken before. He was a half a block behind me. You don't end up half a block behind someone on a route they've never taken before by accident. You end up there because you already know where they're going. Story 3. The Study Room. This story I don't tell very often. Not because I doubt what happened. I stopped doubting it about an hour after it was over. I don't tell it because, even now, a few years out, there's a part of me that telling it puts me back in that room, right back to where I was, and right back to a place I never want to be again. But I think it's worth telling. So, here it is. My junior year, I was working on a thesis project that required large amounts of uninterrupted time. My dorm room was too loud, the main library was too social, and I discovered a study room in the basement of the humanities building that was almost never used. Small room, a long table, decent lighting, no windows, accessible with a student ID until midnight. That room became my place. I went there 4 or 5 nights a week, usually arriving around 8 and working till 11, then making the 10-minute walk back to my building. I'd been using the room for about 6 weeks when I first noticed something was different. I arrived on Wednesday night and at 8:15, unlocked the room with my ID, went in, and everything really seemed normal. I set up my laptop, got my notes out, and just started working. About an hour in, I became aware of a sound I couldn't immediately place, coming from the hallway outside. Not footsteps, not voices, something lower and less distinct. Presence type sound, the kind that registers below the level of something you'd consciously identify. I took my headphones out and I listened. The hallway was quiet. Buildings make sounds. Old humanities buildings especially make sounds. The pipe and beam and settling kind that you learn to just filter out. I had put my headphones back on, but I kept the sound on a low profile to hear. I could hear it distant in the background. 40 minutes later, just after 10, I heard something that wasn't the building. A door handle. The study room door handle, moving slowly, the careful, slow movement of someone trying it without wanting to be heard. The same quality of movement I'd become familiar with from other stories I'd collected in my life by then. I went completely still. I heard my heart beating. The handle moved back in its resting position. Silence. About 30 seconds later, it moved again. I had locked the door from the inside when I arrived. Habit, the same way I locked my door room. The same way I locked my room when I was alone at night in my dorm. The handle moved against that lock, went nowhere, released. Then a knock. 2 of them, soft and slow, with a pause between them that felt considered rather than casual. I didn't answer. I reached for my phone as quietly as I could and opened it. Then a voice, male, low, almost gentle, and almost patient, but still scary. It said, "I know you're in there. I saw your light under the door." I didn't speak. I was already dialing campus security, my thumb moving as quickly as a thumb came across the screen. The voice said, "I just want to talk. You're always in there alone. I've been meaning to introduce myself." Always in there alone. He'd been watching me long enough to know my patterns, to know I came there regularly, and to know I was always by myself. Campus security picked up. I spoke in the lowest voice I could manage and gave them the building and the room number and said there was someone trying to get into the room, and I was completely alone. The operator told me to stay on the line and that someone would be there. From the other side of the door was silence. He was listening to me. Then he said, still in that same low, reasonable voice, "Who are you talking to?" I didn't answer. A longer silence. Then footsteps, moving away from the door, down the hallway, unhurried, the particular pace of someone who has decided to leave on their own terms, rather than because they had to. Campus security arrived 4 minutes later. 2 officers. They swept the basement hallway, checked the adjoining rooms, went upstairs, and checked the ground floor. Nobody found. They walked me back to my building. One of them asked how long I'd been using that study room, and when I said about 6 weeks, he nodded in a way that made me ask what the nod meant. He said there had been a report from a student 2 semesters earlier. Different study room, same building, same basement, same description of someone trying to unlock a door and speaking through it. Nothing had come of the earlier report. The person hadn't been identified, hadn't been caught, and after one incident, it apparently stopped, or appeared to stop. I never went back to that study room. I finished my thesis project in my dorm room with my roommate present and the door locked, which cost me a certain quality of concentration, but was a trade I made without any hesitation. I think about the phrase that stayed with me most of the night, not the part about seeing my light under the door, which is frightening for obvious reasons. The part that came before it. "You're always in here alone." I've been meaning to introduce myself. He'd been watching me long enough to have an always, to have a pattern mapped out, to have been meaning to do something about it for a long time, but it had become a deferred intention rather than a sudden impulse. Which means, for some portion of those 6 weeks, on some nights I sat in that room, alone, thinking that no one knew I was there. Someone knew. Someone had been watching the light under that door and waiting for the night he finally decided to knock. Story 4. I've debated telling this story for a long time. Not because I'm not sure it happened, I'm completely sure, but because there's a specific kind of discomfort that comes with telling a story, where the scariest part isn't the moment everything went wrong. The scariest part is truly how long it had been going on before you even noticed. I was a sophomore when it happened. I'd moved out of my freshman dorms into one of the older residential buildings on the far side of campus, a place called Whitmore Hall, which sounds more distinguished than it was. It was an old building, really long hallways, the kind of place that had been renovated just enough to be functional, but not even close to modern. The doors were heavy and wooden, The locks were the old turnkey kind, rather than the card swipe system the new buildings had, and the heating pipes ran along the basement boards and knocked through the night in a way you either got used to and slept through, or you didn't. It took me some time, but I got used to it eventually. My room was at the end of the hall, on the third floor, which I'd chosen specifically because end rooms had only one neighbor instead of two, and I valued the relative quiet. The room next to mine was occupied by a guy named Pete, who I knew well enough to nod and not too much beyond that, really. The room across the hall was empty for the first weeks of the semester. The student assigned to it had deferred, and nobody knew where he had been placed yet. That detail matters. I want you to hold on to it. My roommate that year was a girl named Sasha. Pre-med, intense study schedule. In the room, maybe half the hours of a typical person would be. She was either in class, in the library, or at the hospital where she volunteered 3 days a week. I liked her. We got along fine, but the particular reality was that I spent a significant amount of the time in the room alone, more than I had been fully prepared for as someone who had a present roommate the previous year. I was alone in the room on a Thursday night when I noticed something that was really wrong at the door. I was at my desk, working, headphones on but low enough to hear the room around me. Around 11, I became aware of a sound from the direction of the door, a faint, almost metallic sound, thin and brief, like a key going into a lock. I took my headphones off immediately and looked at the door. The handle wasn't moving at all. The door was shut, just the way I left it. I sat there for a moment, listening to the hallway, but nothing. Just the pipes. And then put my headphones back on and went back to work, and told myself, it's just the old building. 11 days later, it happened again. This time, I was closer to the door, getting ready for bed, and the sound was just much clearer. Distinctly metallic. Distinctly the sound of something inserted into the keyhole on the outside of the door. I stood completely still and watched the handle. It moved, slightly. The particular small rotation that happens when a key engages a lock. Not all the way, not enough to open the door, just the first partial turn of something inserted and tested almost. Then it stopped. The handle returned to its resting position in complete silence. I stood there for 30 seconds that felt way longer, then went to the door and opened it and looked into the hallway. It was empty. The long, fluorescent lit hallway in both directions, all doors closed, nobody visible. I closed and locked the door and sat on the edge of my bed and spent a few minutes thinking about what I'd just seen and heard and whether it amounted to anything I could report to anyone without sounding like I imagined it or like I was crazy. I decided it didn't. Not yet. A sound and a slight handle movement in an old building with old locks was just not enough to bring to an RA. I started paying closer attention after that, though, specifically to the door and the hallway. I kept my headphones off more often when I was alone. I started noticing things I'd been filtering out, like the fact that the empty room across the hall wasn't always as quiet as an empty room. I assumed the sounds I occasionally heard from it bled through the neighboring rooms. Sounds travel strangely in old buildings, and you learn to attribute things to their most reasonable source. But now that I was listening more carefully, I started to register that the sounds from across the hall had a specific to them that randomly bled through doesn't usually have. Not the muffled bass of someone's music 2 rooms over, something way more complicated, more present. I mentioned it to Pete, my neighbor, casually, without framing it as anything alarming. Just asked if he'd heard anything from the empty room across the hall. He thought about it for a second and said he'd heard something a few times at night, but assumed it was maintenance doing something, and then forgot about it because nothing really ever came of it. Maintenance at night in an empty room? I went to the housing office the next afternoon and asked about the room across the hall, specifically whether anyone had been assigned to it recently. The woman I spoke to checked her records and confirmed it was still listed as vacant. No new assignment had been made. I asked her if maintenance had been working in there. She said not to her knowledge, and that any work orders for that room would have come through her office. There weren't any on file. I went back to my building and stood in the hallway outside the empty room and looked at the door. There was something on the floor in front of it, so small I'd walked past it probably a dozen times without registering it at all. A thin line of dust along the bottom of the door. Not the uniform, settled dust you'd expect from a room that hadn't been open in weeks. It was disrupted, smeared, the kind of disruption that happens when a door had been opened and closed, the air movement pulling the dust and resettling it in a pattern that doesn't match the undisturbed accumulation. That door had definitely been opened recently, and more than once. I went to my RA that night. Her name was Dominique, a senior, someone I'd found competent and straightforward in the very few interactions we've had. I told her everything, the sounds at the door, the handle movement, the noises from the empty room, what the housing office told me in the dust at the base of the door. She listened to all of it without interrupting and then said, "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" I honestly didn't have a good answer for that. She called campus security that same evening. 2 officers came to the hall. One of them used a master key to open the room across from mine. I stood in the hallway and watched the doors swing open. The room was supposed to be empty, stripped down, minimal, the way vacant rooms are kept. Mattress on the bare bed frame, desk clear, nothing personal, nothing indicating occupation. The mattress had a blanket on it. Not a university-issued one, a personal one, dark green, the kind someone brings from home. There was a pillow. On the desk, a water bottle half full and a phone charger plugged into the wall outlet. The end of it resting on the desk where a phone would sit while charging. Someone had been living in that room. The officers went through the space carefully. In the small closet, they found a backpack. Packed, organized, the contents of someone who had been staying somewhere rather than visiting. Changes of clothes, toiletry bag, a worn paperback with a receipt being used as a bookmark. And a receipt dated 2 weeks earlier from a restaurant 3 blocks from campus. A student ID that the officers looked at and then looked at each other in a way that told me it was relevant. I found out later through Dominique, who found out through channels she didn't fully detail to me, that the ID belonged to a former student, someone who had been enrolled that previous year and had been dismissed, not for academic reasons, and whose campus access should have been fully revoked at the time of dismissal. Keyword should have been. The key for the vacant room across the hall, it turned out, was on a master set for that floor and hadn't been updated to exclude dismissed students from the previous year's building assignments. An administrative gap. The kind of small system failure that nobody catches because nobody thinks that anyone would ever do it. He had a key to that room, and based on the contents of the backpack and the state of the mattress and the phone charger plugged into the wall, he'd been using it for at least 2 weeks. 2 weeks of living in the room directly across from mine. The officers asked me a series of questions about whether I'd seen anyone unfamiliar on the floor, whether I'd noticed anyone who didn't seem to belong. I thought back through 2 weeks of coming and going and realized how little I'd paid attention to who I passed in the hallway. You stop seeing your own environment when you're in it every day. You filter out what seems like background. He could have passed me in the hallway, and honestly, he probably did. The part that made it all significantly worse than a former student illegally occupying a vacant room was the door. My door. The one with the metallic sound and the slight handle movement on 2 separate nights. When officers examined my room, they found marks on the exterior keyhole that were consistent with someone having attempted the lock with a key that almost didn't quite fit. The key was for the vacant rooms across the hall, was a floor master for the previous year's assignments, opened some doors on the floor, but not all of them. Mine was among the ones it didn't open. But he tried it, twice that I'd heard, probably more times that I hadn't heard at all. The lock had held, not because of anything I did, not because I'd been particularly careful or smart about it, because of a small, mechanical difference between my door's lock and the ones across the hall. A difference I had no knowledge of and no part in. He was never found in the building that night. The backpack and its contents were taken as evidence. Campus security did a full sweep of Whitmore Hall and the surrounding buildings and found nothing. The investigation that followed, and there was one, a real one, which told me the school understood the severity of the situation, didn't produce an outcome they shared with me in any detail. I was offered a room transfer immediately, and I took it. New building, card swipe locks, a room on the 4th floor with Sasha still as my roommate, which she agreed to do without hesitation when Dominique explained the situation. I finished that year and the following year without another incident, graduated on time to move on in the way you do. But I've thought about those 2 weeks more times than I can count. The fact that he was across the hall, while I had my headphones in, while I was asleep, while Sasha was gone and I was alone in that room for hours, at a stretch believing I was in a private space. I think about the 2 sounds I heard on those nights, the key in my lock, the handle that moved and then didn't. I know now that quiet doesn't mean empty. I know that when you are being watched from 6 feet away through a closed door in a building full of people and you can feel completely alone. I check my locks now, every night without exception, no matter where I am. I check them and check them again. And I have never once taken that for granted, that my lock worked. And although Whitmore Hall was old, it was sturdy.